Welcome to the FNB Budget 2021 reflection and a review on what we all heard in this year's budget speech. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by a panel of guests and experts who will give you and I, the ordinary South African, whether we are part of the working class, we are business owners, or we simply are interested in the economic future of the country, insights and some of the more important highlights of what was said in this year's budget speech. This year's budget speech has certainly been one that most of us have anticipated. In fact, in the 26 years of democracy that we have been citizens in South Africa, this is perhaps one of the landmark speeches related to this country's economic trajectory. But as we know, economies are created in societies and driven by people. So it becomes incredibly important that you and I understand what our role is in driving that economy, rebuilding the economy, and continuing with how we contribute to the economy. Well, certainly it's been a high-stress day for all of us. And ever since we walked into the room, we've all been on our phones, listening to the news headlines, bouncing ideas, checking out the commentary, and of course the social commentary related to this year's budget. And certainly a very anticipated budget, and a budget that in many respects has kept both our markets and us as individual leaders in business both anxious and apprehensive as this week comes to an end. Really from each of your perspectives, and I'm going to allow you to open. What did you think of the minister's speech this afternoon, with you considering some of the highlights, some of the programs he highlighted, and of course some of the regulatory decisions that were made this afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, so from my perspective as really a market analyst, is that it struck a very delicate balance between being market friendly, but also being quite prudent in its approach. And I think what really stood out for me, and the minister said it several times, was that this was not an austerity budget. It is not a budget that frightens pensioners. Certainly, I think grant payments weren't as high as they could have been. The increases were actually quite small, but it's not a scary budget. It is actually pro-growth, because government is looking to channel a lot of its expenditure from paying interest and paying wages and salaries into infrastructure investment, which is something that can make a big difference in terms of South Africa's economic growth trajectory. So I think the markets did react quite positively, and I think it's probably fair that it did.
I think for the large part, I always say that the devil is definitely in the details. Just as Chantal said, it really was a huge attempt to be pro-growth. And I suppose he did as best as he possibly could in what is a very difficult circumstance.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose where to start when it comes to talking about SMEs and small businesses with the backdrop that we've had, and trying to go into a budget speech. So I think, echo the sentiments that so many pieces to try and grapple with, and not least of which is that we are still actually in a pandemic here, which arguably small businesses, SMEs, in fact all businesses have been hit incredibly hard. And I think, personally I would have liked to have seen a bit more of some of the detail coming through with what was mentioned of some of the support broad strokes that came through. Obviously things like tourism being hit incredibly hard, mentions of sort of support package, that 4 billion rand towards from the Department of Small Business. And I suppose it's kind of finding this mixture between trying to, maybe bailout's a word, but I suppose just trying to reset and restart and help out the small business sector versus trying to go in with a growth mindset. I mean, so I guess everybody would want to have heard, let's go and, like we were here saying, and grow the economy, and let's go and make this thing all work. But we've got this backdrop of, wow, we've got a lot of wounds at the moment which small businesses are carrying. So yeah, I think there was some great stuff that came through, and I think just keen to see the keen to see the details that start emerging of, what do these signals actually mean. I'm
really keen to get into the detail. Today we learned that the budget revenue is going to be projected to be 1.35 trillion, which is about 25% of our overall GDP growth in the country. But some of the highlights that came through from the budget speech this afternoon, and I'm really just going to touch on probably the top 5 or 6, just related to debt, was related to the nation's response to COVID-19, was looking at how we further grow the GDP of the country, how, of course, we augment the healthcare, because post-COVID-19, we will continue to need to in the medium term. And then, of course, looking at sponsoring these different programs that have come out, not just because of the pandemic itself, but into some of the critical areas related to economic development, looking at community development and making sure we've got some of our general public services. A very big highlight of this year's budget was related to social well-being, with health, employment and education really right up at the top of it. And we saw large amounts of money moving into new programs to specifically support early childhood development, support making sure that there was social relief in South Africa. We saw also large funds of money going into the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, the ERRP, because I'm going to use that acronym quite a lot as our conversation continues. But we also saw a large amount of money also move into creating public employment opportunities and, of course, engaging young people into the economy through meaningful work. And really, Chantal, I'm going to ask the first question to you. And as we were having our conversation earlier, you were talking about having a little one, but also balancing the demands of work and also balancing some of your own economic interest and your understanding of it. What has been your sense related to the focus now, the ongoing sense that we will need to have related to social well-being? And I know that one of the concerns you had as you opened was that the social relief grants increases were actually negligible against the size and the magnitude of the challenges that society faced. How do we balance a very constrained fiscus versus this massive and deepening crisis that we have related to social relief, but also needing to attend to what our people need?
I guess that's the biggest question in South Africa currently. So I really like direct payments to households as a method of upliftment. I do think that it is proven academically that the multiplier effect when you give direct payments to household is a lot greater than when you're trying to intervene through poverty relief programs or food packages or all the rest of it. So you really want to get as much money as possible to households. The problem is just we've got a pretty constrained fiscus. I would have liked to have seen probably bigger increases in social grant payments, at least meeting inflation, because it's not meeting inflation at the moment. I think between the child grants and the old age grant, we're looking at 1.5% to 2% increases. So that means that people are actually going to start feeling poorer. People who are already struggling are going to struggle more. The second thing that you can do is you can actually look to empower future generations to get themselves, or to perhaps get to a point where they're not dependent on the state anymore. And I think that is why the focus is on early childhood development, because the earlier the intervention, the more successful the outcome ultimately. And that is also another thing that's been academically proven, and I'm sure that government is fully aware of that. But I think another thing that we need to consider as well is a lot of the big employment gap that we have at the moment in South Africa is just because it's so difficult to do business. It's difficult for the labor market to absorb people because it's just so tough to do business. So I think those reforms also actually filter into social relief.
Jesse, social relief, and specifically when we look at the segment you're tasked with looking after within the bank, small business. Small business has been almost the band-aid in South Africa, and entrepreneurship has almost been the band-aid that we have applied to many of our economic challenges, but even some of our socio-economic challenges. And I think right at the top of that is looking at the redress of inequality, unemployment, youth unemployment specifically, and making sure, of course, that most South Africans are put to work. One of the comments I was making earlier on as we were reading through the actual speech and just really reflecting on this point, particularly looking at some of the investments into youth employment, is we've got this population of young people in the country who are both eager and able, but in many respects are actually unemployable as opposed to just unemployed. And of course we can link that back to some of our skills interventions in the country. We've now put an additional 11 billion rand into this particular process and project. We have made and created a focus on early childhood development, but I don't seem to see that we are focused on the output. And the output, of course, creates the very entrepreneurs you are trying to look after, sustain, and obviously grow. How do we help government as private sector participants, as institutions, whether it's academia and the like, to bridge that gap? Because until we bridge that gap, this is a cycle that repeats itself.
Maybe let me start with the concept that we've been using quite a bit internally, and it's this concept of cared for capital. And you've probably heard of things called conscious capital, and you want to know where your money's going. And cared for capital is saying it's not just about throwing money at a problem or throwing money at, let's say, this, the SME sector and hoping it'll come right. You actually need to have people that have got a vested interest in following on and following through and making sure that where we are putting funding is going to result in the right outcomes and the right results. An example is, and what I found quite comforting in what was mentioned was around the support for even the land transformation topic that came up, was that there's been an amount of about, I think it was just over 900 million rand allocated to specifically focus on, let's say, that mentorship and support and skills development and all of that, because there's certainly a lot of projects which the learnings have been that it's not just about the money, it's actually about how you're going to get the right skills across, how you're going to transform. And I think that's a theme that's come through a lot in the budget as well, and I think it's very important is, many a program that government and, private partnership programs and the banks have all been involved in. It's not just about putting money on the table, it's about actually support, mentorship, development. And that also, to your question, I suppose what's also interesting is that amount of 4 billion rand allocated towards, let's sort of small, medium enterprises. But the interesting thing was that it was specifically for rural and for informal sector. And this is something quite important to take note of, is that it's probably the next growth frontier from a tax-based point of view, and it's also where like you mentioned, probably where we're going to pick up the bulk of, let's say, the unemployment issue, is that you've got the bulk of, let's say, unemployed youths and just demographically and geographically located people. That I do believe that's where we do need to be deploying, let's say, the right supportive funding, but then with that cared for capital approach. So got to then follow on with saying, okay, how are we going to then instill entrepreneurial business education, training, transformation, mentorship, all that sort of stuff. So it's money that's kind of well, used. I think, what we've, even in our own worlds, we've tried to deploy, let's say, electronic, education of entrepreneurship. We've launched a very cool thing called Fundaba, which really, it's free for everybody to start getting some business skills. And I suppose, maybe while we're on it, I'll just mention the key thing that came across with the tourism thing. I suppose we can pick up on it a bit later, is that, again, they've now created, well, the signal at least is to create a tourism equity fund. And again, I mean, that's good news, because actually, if you think about it, if this 540 million rand has been allocated towards setting up an actual equity fund, it means that if you're going to take equity in a business, you've got cared for capital. You can't just go and, you're going to have board seats or you're going to have an investment, you've got to look after that. And I think that's good news, because it actually means it's not just about deploying a grant or kind of giving funding, it's actually about caring for that capital and making sure there's a vested interest in transformation, in economic development, in entrepreneurship development.
Thank you so much for breaking down that detail, because on the top of it, and having heard the speech earlier, the moment I sort of heard 4 billion rand only for small development, I was like, oh, It's way too little. Not with the type of issues we have, but also the opportunity we have before us. But really, when you start to look at that focus into the specific sectors, it's about now maintaining the momentum and ensuring that the sustainability goals related to that are realized. So thank you, Jessie, for providing us with that. Now, as we really then look forward, one of the next big questions when we're now saying, well, let's look after small business, let's look after our priority sectors, immediately will always shift the focus to infrastructure in the country. And when we shift to infrastructure in the country, during the pandemic, we saw government holding quite a number of different summits, raising funds and creating new partnerships that specifically wanted to look at our bulk infrastructure in the country, with a big focus on water, a big focus on human settlements, building new cities. We heard about that during the State of the Nation. We looked at power. Boy, oh boy, have we seen the best of that as well. And the best is probably still to come with winter around the corner. So there's been a big focus on some of the bulk infrastructure. But on a daily basis, you and I are faced with infrastructure challenges in our own communities. On the way here, we probably rode over an average 5 potholes. It's raining outside. The traffic lights are definitely out in the metropole around us. Water shortages related to reservoirs not working because of a lack of maintenance. Our cities unable to collect the necessary revenue. And so when we see these very big figures and numbers being raised for big bulk infrastructure, as South African taxpayers, we also then have to worry at which point will we give attention to the smaller details that keep our lives working. Arabile, what are your thoughts at this point in time, having heard now that the commitment behind that 792 billion to the infrastructure fund, which will be obviously worked on a blended finance model? What are your thoughts around its importance and the critical nature of it, and when we'll begin to see that funding actually trickle down into the communities where we need that infrastructure the most?
One thing to remember is that infrastructure actually already leads, once completed and once done right, the sort of social impact is almost immediate. And in that sense, because you've now built an actual building, or you've built the capability for something to actually get done. So the proactiveness that comes with it is very lucrative and important. And the big issue, I suppose, something we could say now is better late than never. This is something we should have had for the longest time already. We've been touting an infrastructure fund even since the World Cup that we hosted, the Football World Cup in 2010. We're 11 years later, and now we're talking about getting this whole thing rolling and making that the forefront of South Africa's growth. So it's now just about the implementation of it, and getting that right is going to be fully dependent on how we view the next growth level. So we seem to have many key priorities, and I'm not saying there should only be one, but what we do, unfortunately, is we pack ourselves into so many different areas, and we actually don't complete the one task that we say we're going to do, and we miss out on doing that, and we miss out on doing something else. So the hope is that this infrastructure fund really does come to the fore and actually is functioning, because it's going to be absolutely necessary. I mean, I'll give you a short sort of notion on this one as well. The 500 billion rand supposed, and I say supposed, stimulus package, because I certainly feel that stimulus is something else entirely. If you were able to take, for example, the backing that you've gotten from banks, from the Reserve Bank, from National Treasury, with regards to the 200 billion rand funding that you said you're going to give to businesses, you've only given out next to 20 billion rand of that. How much more of that backing could you have then used to actually grow the rest of the country, the economy, or even better, the way you do that credit? That then helps infrastructure companies, and they could have done a whole lot more by now.
Chantal, I want to bring you into this conversation as Arabile is making and pointing out that point around the infrastructure fund. With a blended finance approach to it, it means that there are multiple stakeholders and partners to that. And, and a big reliance now on the capital and capacity of the private sector and financial institutions in particular to get involved in the deployment of this infrastructure. from today's speech, from the previous engagements that we've had, and the very tentative nature that our Treasury in the last 5 to 8 years has treated triple Ps, do you see us having turned a significant corner with today's repeated emphasis on triple Ps and private business, please come to the table and get involved? Have we turned a corner? And how does a wealth investor like yourself and somebody who looks after these type of commodities and resources see themselves participating and at the medium term, but also in the long term with the same play and commitment that's required for implementation?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm personally very excited about and also personally very passionate about, because infrastructure investing, even on a large scale, has a very smooth return profile.
Yeah.
So apart from the fact that you are probably going to boost economic growth by employing people, by buying aggregates, buying materials, and putting these projects together and building buildings and building sewage works and finally upgrading the N1. I won't be driving to Welkom by accident again. But once you've got that part of it, and then you have the part where, as a private investor, if you are able to partake in really good projects, you are getting a stable and growing return on your investment. And this is something that we've seen successfully employed in I think Canada, Australia and the US. And some of the biggest infrastructure funds in the world actually invest in public-private partnerships. And I think that is why you saw the minister speak about the user pay principle today as well, because that's one of the things that makes these investments worthwhile for the private sector investor.